Yama, it's SJ Norman here. I'm going to be reading an extract tonight from a longer piece of work called Unspeakable. Unspeakable is an essay. It is the only non-fiction piece in my collection, Permafrost. And it recounts a trip that I made when I was about 23 to Poland, and specifically to Auschwitz-Birkenau, so to the site of the former Nazi concentration camp. I was living in Europe at the time. I'd lived in Europe for the better part of 12 years on and off, and I was living specifically in Germany. So I was thinking a lot at the time about, or experiencing a lot at the time about differential cultural treatments of the history of atrocity in different contexts, and particularly comparing my own experiences in this colony of the kind of pervasive culture of historical denial as distinct from what I witnessed in Europe around the treatment of similar histories. So this essay, just to provide a little bit of context, involves encounters and revelations that I had with objects and spaces in the museum at Auschwitz-Birkenau. A bit of a content warning on this one. It's about Auschwitz, so it's not light. Just fair warning if that's not something that you want to hear about today. And without further introduction, I'll just get into it. The lights flicker on. We're in a stairwell. I'm assailed by odd details. We walk up a flight of steps that leads to the museum and to the archives. We come to a room full of maps and documents. There's a large map of Europe, which takes up a whole wall. The landmass is painted salmon pink, crossed by a network of taut wires strung between nails. A nail hammered in at Dachau, another at Buchenwald, etc. The lights between them represent the transit passages. Auschwitz-Birkenau is right at the center. Here, everything converges. If this was a convex trajectory, we would be standing at the vanishing point. Of all things, I'm reminded of an image from a cartoon, an episode of Danger Mouse that I watched as a kid. Danger Mouse and Penfold get sucked into a black hole, except it wasn't a black hole, it was a pink hole, with swirling lines sucked inexorably downward to one point. This is the first of many unrelated and occasionally absurd images and memories of my own that arise. Flotsam and jetsam from my childhood, for the most part, continually floating to the surface of my mind with each new piece of information that the exhibit offers up. In the faces of the multitudinous dead, I can't help but see people I know. When we enter the infamous room full of human hair, I single out a lone black plait in the mass. I'm reminded of the dismembered braid that my mother keeps in a drawer at home. I cut it off when I was 15. She wept. I think of the spiritual amputation suffered by Native American children in residential schools, the cutting of braids, the severance of culture. I think of all the Indigenous hair that sits in museum basements tagged and numbered, along with our bones. I stare at the glass case full of spectacles, and my eyes are drawn to a pair that looks exactly like those worn by a friend. I wonder what this is achieving, if there is a kind of narcissism inherent in any process of understanding. Familiar images, entirely banal in their nature, are chosen at random. These images hustle and assemble, it seems, to aid the assimilation of a horror of such a scale. Horror, as a filmic or literary genre, relies on familiar settings to achieve its effect. Perhaps true horror, the horror of atrocity and its remnants, relies on the same, if it is to be viscerally understood. If horror is a genre in which a thrill is elicited by a making strange of the familiar, then perhaps museums of atrocity reverse this process. The unimaginable is made personable through the endless accumulation of fine detail. Spectacles, shoes, suitcases, gloves, hair, all of these things were stripped from prisoners upon their arrival and then sorted in the Canada warehouses. I wonder why they kept the hair. Did they use it to stuff mattresses? Did they sell it to wig makers? The phrase dumber than a box of hair asserts itself in my thoughts for a second, and I almost laugh. Like the shoes and everything else, the thing that haunts me most about these objects is not what has been collected, but what has been dispersed. The belongings of the dead were processed and sold on. They were a source of capital for a resource-hungry regime, a regime that was deeply concerned with appealing to the perverse morals of Bavarian Protestantism, waste not, want not. I'm reminded of a bucket of leather gloves at a second-hand store in Kreuzberg that I picked out a pair for myself and a pair for a lover. They would have been about the same vintage, 1930s or 40s. There were hundreds of them, like limp fish in a barrel. How do you account for the provenance of everyday things? How does atrocity spread, like an insidious and invisible fungus, into the tiniest cracks of the ordinary? How long does it hang around for, and how does it mutate? The question persists, why did they keep the hair? There was a purpose for this. I remember the guide telling me what it was. And I remember another conversation that I had with a colleague, a Kurdish artist who makes large-scale sculptures from human hair. Nothing will live in it, she told me, nothing. Once it's cropped from the scalp, it's the deadest thing you can imagine. She said, I have clumps of it in my garden. No animal touches it, not insects, not birds. Nothing will build a nest out of it. I remember telling her that I was brought up to never leave hair behind in a brush, to sweep it up carefully after trimming my fringe. This is the final exhibit, a series of empty rooms. In the basement of the barracks which houses the museum, there's a labyrinthine complex of cells. Again, as we descend, the first thing I'm reminded of is something from my childhood, the sinister crawl space underneath a house I lived in once, and my older brother play threatening to lock me down there. This memory comes to me with its edges sanded off, blurred with dreams and other realities. What lingers is not an image, but a sense, a recognition of the subterranean as something fearful. It is, it seems, the earliest part of me that connects with this fear. Barely suppressed beneath the sensible adult, there is the raw panic of a very young child. There's a long corridor illuminated by naked bulbs, like the bronchi that feed each lung. The core pipeline spiders off into ever-diminishing passageways lined with cells. The cells range from the size of a bedroom to the size of a closet. These ones, the small ones, are starvation cells, the vertical version of the oubliette, from the French oublier, to forget, which is to be found beneath the dungeon floor of most medieval castles throughout Europe and the UK. It's a medieval idea, medievally barbaric, that stands out against the hyper-modern mass industrialized barbarism that generally distinguishes the Third Reich from other genocidal machines. In each cell, there's standing room for a single prisoner who would be sealed in there without food or water and left to die on their feet. Even in the denigrated, half-starved state in which most prisoners would have made it into these cells, death by starvation is a lengthy process. It's weeks in most cases. This is one of many contradictory answers to the assertion of the Reich's supposed efficiency, that quality which German society continues to pride itself on. I've spent enough time living in Germany by now to know that this cultural myth is just that, a myth. The Nazis were just as sloppy and gleefully cruel as any other genocidal machine. The walls are greenish. They're covered with scratches. What looks from a distance like a frenzied scramble of marks reveals itself at closer inspection to be incredibly detailed graffiti. It's predominantly religious in motif, and every major faith of Europe appears to be represented, as well as every language. Polish Catholics, with their particularly developed grasp of the aesthetics of iconography, are the most visible on these particular walls. It's when I focus on an elaborately carved image of the crucifixion that, for the first time in this strange, numb journey, I feel completely overcome. It's in its presence, and this image has a presence beyond representation, that something connects. It's a heart-sized object on the wall of a starvation cell, and it's so passionately, intricately, and sensitively carved. It's not the religiosity of the image that moves me, nor even the circumstances or context of its production, but its artistry, its beauty. That's that. Thank you.